Spring 1915. The Western Front had frozen into silence. 1,000 miles of trenches carved the land like scars, and between them lay nothing but mud, wire, and death. The war that was supposed to end quickly had already eaten a generation. Both sides waited, blind and bitter, for something, anything, to break the stalemate. And then, one afternoon in April, the wind began to change. The soldiers in the front lines saw it first, a pale green haze drifting over the fields near Ypres. They thought it was smoke. They thought it was cover for another German attack. But it was neither. It was the birth of a new kind of horror, the first breath of death itself. The Battle of Ypres, 1915, where men learned that war had changed forever, where courage met terror, where civilization itself began to dissolve in the green mist. Winter had left the fields of Flanders broken and gray. The trees stood like skeletons, their branches stripped bare by months of shell fire. Rainwater gathered in the trenches until it became mud, and the mud became a second skin for the men who lived in it. For months now, the war had been locked in place. The lines barely moved, only the graves did. Each sunrise brought the same sound, artillery far away, boots squelching through the muck, and the faint, dull hum of despair. In early 1915, the town of Ypres, once a quiet medieval jewel of Belgium, was little more than rubble and smoke. The air smelled of burnt hay, gunpowder, and decay. Still, soldiers joked that Ypres was easier to pronounce as Wipers, and the name stuck, a dark humor to soften the horror. Every army on the Western Front knew this place. Every army bled for it. Ypres was a crossroads, a wedge of high ground guarding the gateway to the Channel ports, Calais, Dunkirk, Boulogne. If the Germans took it, they could sever Britain from the continent. If the Allies held it, the war could grind on. That single fact condemned tens of thousands to die in its mud. By March 1915, both sides had settled into a grim routine. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, a vast scar dividing Europe in two. The Germans, well-fed and organized, fortified their positions with concrete bunkers and firing steps. Opposite them, the French and British, weary and undersupplied, tried to live among the rats and rot. At night, the wind carried the cries of the wounded between the lines. Men grew old in weeks. No one spoke of glory anymore. Corporal John McCrae, a Canadian doctor stationed near Ypres, wrote in his diary, "This war is no longer about courage. It is about endurance. The only heroes are those who can still feel something." He would later write a poem that would outlive them all, In Flanders Fields. But in April 1915, that poem was still unborn. Only the suffering was real. The spring brought a strange quiet to the front. After months of rain and freezing winds, the skies cleared. Birdsong returned, a cruel reminder of peace. The Germans, from their observation posts on the ridges east of Ypres, could see the Allied trenches clearly now. Through binoculars, the fields looked almost peaceful, like a painting. But beneath the surface, both sides were planning. The Allies were preparing another small offensive, another futile push meant to straighten the line. The Germans, however, were preparing something entirely new, something the world had never seen. In Berlin, scientists under the direction of Fritz Haber, a brilliant chemist and patriot, had convinced the High Command to test a new weapon, chlorine gas. Invisible in its vapor form, heavier than air, and deadly to breathe. It would kill not with shrapnel, but with suffocation. The lungs would burn, the throat would close. Death would come in agony, unseen, unstoppable. Haber believed it would end the war quickly, terrify the enemy into surrender. He saw it as science serving victory. Opposing the German lines was a mix of French and British units, and in between them, the 1st Canadian Division, newly arrived from across the Atlantic. The Canadians were young, eager, and untested. They had left farms, offices, and small towns believing they would fight for honor and empire. They sang as they marched into Ypres. Within weeks, their laughter would be gone. Lieutenant Colonel John Curry, commanding one of the Canadian battalions, described the front as a slaughterhouse disguised as a trench. The sandbags leaked water, the rifles jammed. The stench of rotting bodies hung in the damp air. Still, morale was high. They believed, as soldiers always do, that the next battle might be the last. The French on their left flank were North African colonial troops, brave men, veterans of other wars, but ill-equipped and poorly informed. They had never seen gas masks, nor could they imagine the kind of horror that was coming. In the early months of 1915, German High Command faced a grim truth. The Western Front was stuck. Attacks cost thousands of lives for a few hundred yards of mud. So, they turned to science. The idea of using poison gas had been debated, even outlawed, before the war. But desperation breeds cruelty. The German Fourth Army, under Duke Albrecht of Württemberg, was chosen to test the new weapon. Over 5,000 steel cylinders, filled with liquefied chlorine, were secretly transported to the front near Ypres. Each cylinder weighed 90 pounds, fitted with a simple valve. They were buried into the parapets of the German trenches, their nozzles aimed toward the Allied lines. All that was needed was the right wind. A steady breeze from the northeast, blowing gently toward the enemy. For weeks, the Germans waited. The weather was watched like an oracle. And then, on April 22nd, the wind began to shift. On the evening before the attack, the fields were strangely beautiful. The sun set behind the shattered trees of Flanders, painting the clouds in gold and violet. Men wrote letters home, smoked their last cigarettes, joked about the mud. They did not know that they were standing on the edge of history, that within hours the world would cross an invisible line, and war would never be the same again. In the German trenches, officers whispered final orders. At precisely 5 o'clock the next day, the valves would open. The wind would carry the gas. The age of steel and honor would give way to the age of chemistry and terror. And in Ypres, the quiet hell waited, holding its breath. The morning of April 22nd, 1915, dawned clear and calm. The wind that had refused to blow for weeks now drifted softly from the northeast toward the Allied lines. A perfect day for death. At 5 in the afternoon, the German trenches came alive with quiet movement. Engineers crouched beside rows of metal cylinders, their hands trembling as they turned the valves. From thousands of nozzles, a strange hiss filled the air, the sound of history exhaling its first poison. Within minutes, a pale green cloud began to roll across the fields. It shimmered in the sunlight, beautiful and wrong, like the surface of the sea. The soldiers who saw it could not understand what they were looking at. On the Allied left flank, the French troops, many of them Algerian and Moroccan colonial soldiers, watched in confusion as the fog drifted closer. It was not smoke. There had been no bombardment, no warning. Some laughed nervously. Others shouted that the Germans were trying to use a smoke screen. Then the wind carried it over them. Within seconds, the men began to cough, violently, uncontrollably. Their eyes burned, their throats closed. The green mist filled their lungs, turning breath into fire. One officer recalled, "They clutched their throats, they staggered, they fell where they stood. Their faces turned black. Their lips blue. They were dying without a wound." Panic spread faster than the gas itself. The Algerian units broke and fled, stumbling back through the Canadian lines, gasping, clawing at their necks. The dead lay in twisted shapes, hands frozen at their throats. Within 10 minutes, a 4-mile gap had opened in the Allied line. The Germans had done the impossible, not with shells or rifles, but with air. For a moment, the German soldiers stared in shock at what they had done. They had been told the gas would disable, not kill. Now they watched through their masks as entire enemy regiments collapsed. But confusion and disbelief held them back. Many feared their own gas would drift back toward them. Others were too stunned by the sight to move. When orders finally came to advance, it was already dusk. The German infantry moved cautiously into the green void, stepping over the bodies of the dead. They encountered almost no resistance. Ahead of them lay open ground, undefended trenches, abandoned guns, silence. The road to Ypres was wide open, and yet they stopped. Whether through hesitation, fear, or lack of orders, the Germans failed to press the advantage. The most decisive opportunity of the war, to break the Western Front entirely, slipped away with the fading light. The wind, too, began to die. The green cloud thinned, leaving only the stench of chlorine and corpses behind. To the right of the collapsing French sector stood the 1st Canadian Division, some 18,000 men holding the line near Saint-Julien. They saw the gas rolling toward them and understood, too late, what was happening. Without gas masks, they improvised. Men urinated on handkerchiefs and held them over their faces, the ammonia helping neutralize the chlorine. It was crude, but it worked. They fought not only for survival, but to hold the line, to keep the Germans from breaking through the gap left by the French retreat. It was a fight against both the enemy and the air itself. For 2 days, they endured constant shelling and renewed gas attacks. The chlorine burned their lungs, stripped their voices, blinded some men permanently. Still, they refused to yield. Lieutenant Colonel John Curry wrote in his report, "We were fighting ghosts, the enemy, the gas, and the dead who would not fall." By the 2nd day, their rifles jammed from dust and corrosion. They fired until their ammunition ran out, then fought with bayonets and fists. The wounded crawled back to the trenches, coughing blood. When reinforcements finally arrived, less than half of the division could still stand. But Ypres had not fallen. The Canadians had done what no one thought possible. They had stopped the German breakthrough. Ypres. On April 24th, the Germans tried again. This time, they released the gas directly at the Canadian positions. The green cloud swept low, hugging the ground, curling into the trenches like a living thing. Men screamed for water, for air, for mercy. Their bodies convulsed as the chlorine destroyed their lungs. One survivor described it later. "You drowned standing up, your lungs filled with your own blood. Every breath was a knife." The wind shifted suddenly, blowing some of the gas back toward the German lines. Panic spread among them now, their own weapon turning against them. Both sides choked and died in the same poisoned air. In that moment, the front dissolved into chaos. Men fired blindly, unable to see through the haze. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. The battlefield became a hallucination, green, choking, silent. News of the gas attack spread quickly across Europe. At first, many refused to believe it. Poison gas? It sounded like something from a nightmare, not the battlefields of civilized nations. But the photographs and the testimonies told the truth. Men with blackened faces and blistered lungs filled the hospitals. Their eyes were swollen shut. Their bodies trembled long after the gas had passed. In London, the newspapers called it a crime against humanity. In Berlin, it was hailed as a scientific triumph. And in the trenches, both sides knew only one thing. The rules of war had died at Ypres. The age of honor was gone. From now on, no soldier would ever trust the wind again. When the gas finally cleared, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Dead horses lay where they had fallen, their mouths foaming green. The grass itself had turned yellow. Rivers ran with oil and blood. More than 6,000 men had died in the first few hours of the attack. Thousands more were blind, coughing blood, or insane from what they had seen. The Germans had advanced 2 miles, but lost their soul in the process. They had opened a door that could never again be closed. Across Europe, military scientists began to study the new weapon. Within months, both sides would develop gas shells, masks, and more deadly compounds: phosgene, mustard, diphosgene. What began at Ypres would spread to every front, every army, every soldier's nightmare. Among the survivors, the memories never faded. Men spoke of green ghosts rising from the fields at night. Some refused to sleep when the wind blew from the east. For the Canadians, Ypres became a baptism of fire and gas. Their courage was celebrated across the empire, but many could no longer speak above a whisper. Their lungs were burned, their voices stolen forever. John McCrae buried his friends that spring and wrote the first lines of his poem. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. Those words would travel farther than any shell, but they could never erase the stench of that green cloud. After Ypres, the front grew quieter, not out of peace, but of dread. Every soldier now watched the horizon for the shimmer of gas. Every breeze became a warning. The battlefield had become not just a place of death, but of terror. From that moment on, the war would no longer be about courage alone. It would be about survival in a world where even the air could kill you. How night fell over Ypres like a funeral shroud. The sky burned red from artillery. The earth trembled beneath the weight of endless shells. And yet, amid the chaos, a single truth remained. The line still held. The French had broken. The air was poison. The ground was soaked with bodies and blood. But the Canadians, the boys from Montreal, Winnipeg, and Toronto, were still there. Exhausted, coughing, half-blind, but unbroken. They were the line between survival and catastrophe. By April 25th, the battle around St. Julien had become a nightmare without dawn. The trenches were shallow ditches filled with mud, corpses, and chlorine residue. The stench was indescribable, a mixture of death, blood, and the acrid sting of gas. A captain wrote in his journal that night, "We no longer distinguish the living from the dead. Those who breathe are dying. Those who lie still are already gone." The wounded gasped for air that no longer existed. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Nurses covered their faces with wet cloths, trying not to faint as they tended to men whose lungs were dissolving inside them. Still, the orders were clear: hold the line. There was no talk of retreat, no thought of surrender. Every trench, every farm, every pile of rubble became a fortress. My courage in this new war no longer meant charging bravely into fire. It meant staying when every instinct screamed to run, staying when your skin burned and your throat closed, staying when your friends died beside you. The Canadians held a salient, a bulge in the line that could be attacked from three sides. They were surrounded, bombarded day and night, their supply lines cut. But each time the Germans attacked, they rose to meet them. Machine guns jammed with mud. Ammunition ran low. The dead were piled into the parapets to strengthen the walls. One soldier wrote home, "We had no gas masks, no reinforcements, no hope. Only the thought that if we fall here, the enemy reaches Calais." The men knew the truth. If they broke, the road to the sea would open again, and Britain itself could be cut off from the continent. They fought not for victory, but for time. At dawn on April 26th, the Germans attacked again, supported by artillery and a second wave of gas. The air turned green once more. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The sound of the shells was muffled, as if the world itself were choking. But behind that haze, the Canadians launched a counterattack. It was madness, bayonets against machine guns, men coughing blood as they charged through the gas. Yet somehow it worked. They retook the small village of St. Julien, fighting house by house, trench by trench. Every step cost dozens of lives. But they bought time, precious hours that allowed reinforcements to arrive. By evening, what was left of the division, barely 4,000 men, had held a front meant for 20,000. As the days passed, Ypres became a graveyard without boundaries. Shells cratered the landscape until it looked like the surface of another planet. Every shell hole filled with rainwater and blood. The dead floated in them like broken dolls. Birds no longer flew over the battlefield. Even nature seemed to recoil. One war correspondent wrote, "It is not a place on earth anymore. It is a place where the earth itself bleeds." And yet amid this ruin, men still fought, crawling through mud, bayoneting shadows, choking on air that reeked of metal and death. Yom. There came a moment, somewhere between April 27th and 28th, when no one knew what day it was. Time had dissolved, replaced by an endless rhythm of shells, screams, and gas alarms. German prisoners wept as they were captured. They had seen their own comrades suffocate when the wind shifted. Even the victors were dying. For the first time, soldiers on both sides began to whisper that this was no longer war. It was murder. Not from malice, but from machinery. Not from hatred, but from progress. Fritz Haber, the chemist who created the chlorine gas, would later be called a genius and a monster. His wife, Clara, would take her own life in despair a few weeks after Ypres, and the world would march on, deeper into its madness. Letters found later told more than any report. A young private wrote to his mother, "The gas came again today. I can still see their faces, green and blue. I dream of air that doesn't hurt." Another wrote, "If I survive this, I will never light another fire. The smoke reminds me." And from a French sergeant, "The wind has become the enemy. I look at the sky and pray it stays still." These words were never meant to be read by historians. They were confessions sent from the edge of humanity. By the end of April, British reinforcements arrived, tired, shocked, and unprepared for what they saw. They brought the first improvised gas masks, cloth soaked in urine and sodium bicarbonate. It was pitiful, but better than nothing. The front stabilized once again, though at an unspeakable cost. The Allies had lost over 70,000 men. The Germans, nearly as many. The land itself had become toxic, and through it all, the name Ypres began to echo across Europe, whispered with fear, with awe, with disbelief. It was no longer a town. It was a symbol. When news of the defense reached London and Ottawa, newspapers hailed the Canadians as heroes. But those who survived felt no pride, only exhaustion. A chaplain who visited the front wrote, "They stood because they could not fall. They endured because the dead could not relieve them. The line had not broken, but it had nearly shattered the men who held it. Some wept when the shells stopped, not from joy, but from the sudden silence. The quiet felt unnatural, heavier than the bombardment itself. They knew it would return. It always did." By early May, the gas attacks ceased, for now. The Germans had achieved little ground, but their experiment had succeeded in another way. The world had seen what science could do to the soul. At sunset, the sky above Ypres glowed green from chemical fires. One officer described it as a second sun, the color of sickness. The trenches were filled with a phosphorescent mist. The ground glittered faintly at night where the gas had burned into the soil. The landscape itself seemed haunted. The war had created something new, a beauty so terrible it could only be called obscene. When it was over, the Canadians were relieved by fresh troops. They could barely walk. Some coughed blood for weeks. Others could no longer speak. Their eyes were red, their skin blistered. But they had done the impossible. Against the first chemical weapon in history, against the terror of suffocation, against fear itself, they had not broken. The French poet Charles Péguy once wrote before the war, "The courage of the soldier is to keep standing when everything falls." At Ypres, that courage became something more. Not a triumph, but a testament. A proof that even when the air turns to poison, The human spirit still fights to breathe. Yes, when the guns finally fell silent around Ypres, the silence felt unreal. Too deep, too wide, too final. The air still shimmered faintly green in the evening light, and the earth itself seemed to sigh, as if exhausted by what mankind had done to it. No one celebrated. No one sang. There was only coughing, weeping, and the sound of boots in the mud. The Germans had gained a few miles of ground. The Allies had held their line. But beneath those small victories and losses, something much greater had shifted. The world had changed, and no one could yet name how. Before Ypres, soldiers still believed, however faintly, in the myths of honor and heroism. Battles were meant to be won by bravery, by discipline, by men facing each other in combat. But at Ypres, all of that dissolved in a green mist. Courage still existed, but it was no longer noble. It was the courage of endurance, of suffering without meaning. A man could fight with all his heart and still die choking on the air he breathed. The philosophers of Europe had once written that war was the test of nations. At Ypres, that test turned into a confession of cruelty, of ingenuity without conscience. The French journalist Gaston Rieu wrote after visiting the front, "We have entered a time when death no longer comes from the enemy's bullet, but from the imagination of his scientists." The old world of gallantry, of duels and flags and drums had died. And in its place, a new age was born, the mechanized, industrial, and chemical war. War as science, war as industry, war as hell made efficient. In Berlin, Fritz Haber stood before the High Command and declared the experiment a success. He called chlorine gas a civilized weapon, one that would shorten the war and save lives by forcing surrender. He did not see the faces of the men who had died choking, or the eyes of those who would never breathe normally again. He did not smell the fields where the grass had turned yellow and the soil would not grow crops for years. For a brief moment, the world congratulated itself on its cleverness. Then the Allies answered in kind. By 1916, the British would develop their own gas shells. The French would perfect phosgene, 10 times deadlier than chlorine. And by 1917, the Germans would unleash mustard gas, a weapon that burned skin, blinded eyes, and lingered for weeks. The genie was out of the bottle. What began at Ypres would not end there. The wind would carry its poison from Flanders to Verdun, from the Somme to Passchendaele. The age of gas had begun. Those who survived Ypres carried it inside them forever. They became the green ghosts of the Western Front, men who coughed blood in their sleep, whose voices rasped like paper, whose lungs whistled with every breath. For the rest of their lives, they flinched when the wind changed. They avoided the smell of bleach and burning wood. Some could never again walk through fog without trembling. They did not talk about heroism. They spoke of survival. They remembered comrades who had drowned in air, who had clawed at the earth trying to find clean oxygen in the dirt. In letters and poems, they tried to explain what words could not. That Ypres was not a victory or a defeat. It was a revelation of how fragile the human body was and how limitless human cruelty could become. Long after the armies left, Ypres refused to rest. Rain unearthed bones. Farmers plowing their fields struck unexploded shells that still leaked poison when opened. The soil itself remained toxic for decades. Even today, in the fields of Flanders, farmers speak of the iron harvest. The shells and fragments that rise from the ground each spring, as if the earth is still trying to purge its memory. The poppies grew there because nothing else could. Their red petals fed on the disturbed soil, a strange beauty born of tragedy. John McCrae saw them bloom among the graves and wrote his poem not as comfort, but as warning. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep. The poppies became a symbol of remembrance. But for those who had been at Ypres, remembrance was not peace. It was the constant return of the smell, the color, the scream. To the high commands, Ypres was another statistic, a tactical experiment, a temporary success. Reports spoke of effective use of chemical agents and enemy disorganization. But no report could measure the moral collapse that followed. After Ypres, the idea of restraint vanished. If gas was possible, then anything was possible. The taboo had been broken. By 1916, every great power was stockpiling chemical shells. The scientists of Europe, once the pride of civilization, now designed better ways to kill unseen. Factories turned out poison as easily as they once made soap or sugar. The line between science and slaughter blurred until it vanished. And the war rolled on, consuming all. And when the war finally ended in 1918, the survivors returned home, changed beyond recognition. They had seen the world end once, in green fire, and they knew it could end again. Governments signed treaties banning chemical weapons, but the knowledge could not be forgotten. The formulas were written, the factories stood ready, the scientists still alive. Ypres had taught the world a terrible lesson, that progress and morality do not always march together, that the mind can move faster than the soul. And though peace returned, it was a haunted peace, a silence filled with the memory of gas drifting across no man's land, of lungs burning, of eyes turning to glass. For the men who fought there, Ypres became a scar that never healed. It was spoken of in whispers. The place of the gas, the green hell. Even decades later, veterans would pause when the wind blew from the east. They would glance at the horizon, remembering the day the air itself betrayed them. For historians, Ypres was a turning point, the moment when war ceased to be human. For poets, it was the death of innocence. And for the world, it was the beginning of something that would reach far beyond 1915. For the first time, mankind had learned how to kill invisibly. The boundary between weapon and nature had been crossed. The atmosphere itself had become a battlefield. A century later, the fields of Flanders are quiet again. The trenches are grassed over, the ruins rebuilt. Tourists walk where soldiers once drowned in gas, their laughter mingling with birdsong. But when the wind rises and the clouds darken, locals say the air still tastes faintly metallic, as if the earth remembers. Ypres endures not as a story of victory or defeat, but as a warning, the moment when civilization proved it could destroy itself in the name of progress. The first gas cloud rolled out of the German lines in 1915. It has never truly disappeared. It lingers, invisible, in every fear of chemical war, in every weapon born of science without conscience. And so, the Battle of Ypres remains what it has always been. Not a battle for land, but for the soul of humanity. They did not die for glory. They died for breath.